Welcome, Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the work, the ideas, and the theory of Otto Kernberg. So, Otto Kernberg has been a very prolific writer, an essayist, a thinker, and at time of recording, he's still with us. And he also sometimes gives interviews on YouTube. So, his work even stretches to nowadays, which is incredible. And he's one of the last big name psychoanalysis that has shaped the field. And fundamentally, he himself has done introductions to psychoanalysis on the IPA channel, which are very good and I highly recommend them. But I wanted to talk about his work in my own way. And I also hope and intend this video to be an homage to his work, which has been incredibly valuable to me as a therapist, a clinician, and a psychologist. So the main three books that have shaped my understanding of Otto Kernberg's work is Love Relations, Aggression in Personality Disorders and Perversion, and also on the borderline condition and narcissistic disorders, which I haven't here because I've lent it to a colleague, but all the three of them very good. I know he's wrote more, and I intend to read them and review them one day, but I haven't yet read them. So there you have it. So please understand that this is only an introduction. So what is so incredible about Otto Kernberg's work? Well, he was one of the pioneers of work with borderline patients, narcissistic patients, as before him and Cohut, I'm saying it in the French way, fundamentally, those people, those groups of individuals were thought of as beyond psychoanalysis, or psychoanalysis was not really able to help them, not fundamentally. But Otto Kernberg developed models of thinking to try and help those people. So nowadays he's very well known for transfer-focused therapy, which fundamentally is a twice-a-week work with borderline patients, in which the whole goal is to help them realize the object, meaning the relationship with others, how it was internalized inside them, and how they resolve the tension with splitting, which creates other types of problems, splitting between the good and bad object and between the good and bad self, which creates dyads in which is going to be this idealization and devaluation. And the whole point of transfer-focused therapy is to help the patient at the core to be able to help them build a whole object relationship, meaning that both good and bad will be combined and give way to a gray area between both of them, which is the whole object theory, right? It's this whole point of view of a human with all the nuance and all the complexities of a human being. No one is wonderful and no one is terrible, quote unquote. So you kind of have a gray area for virtually everyone. And that's what borderlines can build with transfer-focused therapy. He also created a very interesting concept, which one day I'll talk about in more detail, but of identity diffusion, i.e. the things I was talking about, that the identity of the borderline is in flux. It oscillates between being completely good, happy, and potentially helpful to completely devalued, feeling oneself as worthless, as trashful, and so on and so forth. And the whole point of transfer-focused therapy is to be able to build the self, to integrate both phenomena and to prevent identity diffusion. So it's very important work he has done. And he also, in his work, has worked with narcissistic patients and tried to also develop transfer-focused therapy for them and their needs. So it's very important work indeed. So very fundamentally, one of the other very interesting aspects of Kernberg is that he was a theorician of aggression, that he talked a lot about hatred, about aggression, about rage, and both of the patient towards the environment, but the patient towards himself, but also the patient towards the therapist. And he was very adamant in creating an idea of countertransference, which could guide us to helping those people. his idea of countertransference is also very linked to Klein's idea of projective identification, in which someone is going to put a field that they can't stand, which is in them. They're going to project it onto the clinician. The clinician is going to experience it, live through it and survive it, and then give it back to the patient in a more digestible way. But fundamentally, that is at the core of Kernberg's work, is this idea that fundamentally the therapist has to be able to put boundaries in place, boundaries that are solid, that the borderline or narcissistic patient is going to test them, and they have to stand. In Aggression in Personality Disorders and Perversion, he even talks about a patient that would regularly insult him and take his seat. As an analyst, he would take his seat and start imitating him in humiliating ways. He said, and this is very important, he said that you shouldn't interpret as you would use interpretation as fundamentally as a retaliation tool, but you should try to put yourself in the perspective of the patient and try and interpret from a place in which the patient can understand. And through therapy, that patient calmed down and did accept Otto Kernberg's interpretations slowly but surely. And that's a lot of the work of Kernberg, is how to deal with extreme situations. And throughout his work, he does talk about a lot about the types of transference that we might encounter. And it's very, very important theories, because for him there's 3 types of transference for the narcissist. 4 types if we really want to go into full detail. So those 4 types are psychopathic transference, which might seem very bad, but what you have to understand is, for Kernberg, it's the moment when a narcissist is like, no, everything's fine, everything's perfect, and everything looks just fine on the surface, and they're trying to give that idea that nothing's wrong. However, this is a facade, and once you go through the facade, what happens is that they develop paranoid transference, in which they feel that you want to hurt them, that you're like all the others, that once you've broken through, you're just there to hate them and to destroy them. Here they feel very, very persecuted, and he says that it's very important in those moments to still stay focused in the therapy and not to take that persecution just for yourself, and not take all the responsibility. That this is a moment in which the patient has to go through, because it's reawakening the paranoid schizoid. I always make the mistake of, because in French it's schizoparanoid, in English it's paranoid schizoid. So fundamentally, it reawakens that position in which the individual feels very persecuted. And he said that once the persecution can be experienced by the patient, but within the frame of therapy, it can lead to the depressive position, i.e. the other one is an external object and no longer an internal object, because that's the problem of a lot of those pathologies with personality disorders, that other people are seen not as external people, but as projections of the internal world. And to an extent, everyone does that, but it's to an extent. With personality disorders, it's like much more massive, and in truth, there is a 4th position I was implying of perverse transference. That the idea of perversity is very interesting, and he goes into detail in this book on what is perversity. Perversity is the idea that there's a corruption of what is good into what is, and then twists it into something bad, something wrong. Is that also can be the case for a form of transference. Instead of going into depressive position and understanding that the other one is external, and therefore re-establishing okay-ish object relations, they're going to twist it and create a sense of wrongness in the therapy. So very interesting work. And that those patients he had, which were type of patients that could be very extreme, helped him develop theories that now help us with the treatment of those people. There's also this very interesting point of view that Kernberg adopts, that, for example, what helps is, of course, the benevolency of the therapist, but also the rules, the framing of the therapy, i.e. the therapist and the patient have a very clear, both of them, understanding of what is acceptable and not acceptable. And you have to be very clear. For example, with this extreme patient I was talking about a bit earlier in the video, the one that would insult him, he made it very clear that if he was trying to blackmail him with suicide, like he would save his life, but he would end therapy. There would be no pursuing after that. And it did work. That patient never threatened to commit suicide as he did with his previous therapists. So the frame is incredibly important in Kernberg's work and is essential. And I feel that often as therapists we are tempted to somewhat see the frame as too restrictive, but it does, and it is very, very important. And I think he's completely right in pointing it out in this very fundamental way. Now, in other terms, what Kernberg teaches us is that people that we felt before were unable or not capable of having therapy are in fact treatable, but treatable within the mind frame of there has to be very strict rules. And also, very interestingly enough, for Kernberg, when you have someone with a personality disorder in therapy, what you never have to forget is that there is two versions, quote unquote, of those people. There is a version of them that's archaic, i.e. has very primitive defense mechanisms, splitting, denial, projection, omnipotent defenses, and so on and so forth. However, there is also, at the same time, a secondary point of view in which they have an Oedipal framework, in which they did experience the Oedipus complex, which in psychoanalytic terms is that their personality did experience something of limits, something of prevention of complete transgression, and that you always have to, at all times in therapies, keep both lines in your mind when you're treating those people, as sometimes the interpretations need to be Oedipal, i.e. on the idea of guilt, transgressiveness, and the fear of losing love, and also more archaic, rage-filled and destructive elements in which you sometimes have to catch on to the paranoid aspect, and you have to jump from one to the other in the context of what is happening with the patient, obviously. But it's very interesting, as before him, it was kind of split, a bit like them in a way, that all you did in very early archaic interpretations, and you had archaic representations, or you had Oedipal, and you would only go for the Oedipus complex. And he, very interestingly enough, merges both those ideas to create a sort of middle ground. It's not the only time he does that, because fundamentally, Otto Kernberg, I think, is one of the best theoreticians in terms of merging theoretically and with elegance the ideas of drives and object relations. So Freudian drives for him were not just the fact of you're born with them and you're stuck with them. It's more like they're shaped by the good experiences, and they're also shaped by the bad experiences. The good experiences are going to lead to what he calls a happy self. In one of his videos on the borderline notes, that happy self is all the positive moments that the person experiences. And when they're good enough, they're going to develop the personality, and hopefully the personality is going to be neurotic leveled, meaning that fundamentally there's access to guilt, there's access to object reparation, and there is access to the fact of the other one is external. However, when there's negative experiences, it's going to lead to aggression, to destructivity, which are going to be in complete contrast with the happy self. In a way, it's a form of bad self or suffering self that's going to attack the happy self. And fundamentally, all those bad experiences are going to be internalized, meaning the person cannot construct a continuous sense of self, but on the contrary, it's discontinuous, meaning it's kind of broken. So at the very core, because it's broken within, it becomes broken without, and others are idealized or devalued completely, because fundamentally it's discontinuous as they own self is discontinuous. So here we can see that by merging drive theories with object relationship theories, he creates a complete system in which we can both understand both Freud and Kernberg at the same time. Now I'm talking about these authors because Freud is very important in Otto Kernberg's work, but also Kernberg, even if he quotes him much less. But very interestingly enough, Otto Kernberg was one of the men that put Kernberg back in the light of day because he had been kind of forgotten. So everything we talk about Kernberg and the approach of Kernberg was put back in the limelight by Otto Kernberg. So fundamentally interesting, a little bit of trivia for you. But anyway, about this happy self and bad self, there is that idea that through therapy, one can reconnect both of them, merge them to create a stable sense of self and a stable sense of identity that will then help them in their relationships. Because as the therapist builds a relationship with the patient, of course a professional relationship, and through the analysis of the contents of the patients, the happy self can be stabilized in a much better way and is less vulnerable to regressions. And he also implies something very interesting in his book Regression in Personality Disorders and Perversions, how he implies that defense mechanisms are not inherently psychotic, not in the borderline case, but it's more like they're more archaic, like the first ones to be used, but they're not in essence psychotic, which I find very interesting because it goes against mainstream psychoanalysis, at least in this aspect. Speaking of mainstream psychoanalysis, he was for a couple of years president of the IPA, International Psychoanalytic Association, and he wrote a very interesting article on how to destroy the creativity of young analysts. Of course, that essay was meant as a joke, right? It's not like you should apply it. It's more like a criticism of the institutions. So it's nice to see that he always remained critical of psychoanalysis on the whole, and that fundamentally it's not because he was part of it that he couldn't, in a way, try and change it. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out that way, but the attempt is noble, I think, in of itself. So, very fundamentally, he's an author which also understood personality along the line of development. For him, for example, narcissists were not that much that they were stuck at a certain level of development, but they had another way of developing their narcissism. Like, it's not stuck at the early point. They went of another direction, a direction in which fundamentally it was belittle or be belittled. So they built a carapace of a personality to not suffer through the trauma of being belittled ever again, or at least in their minds ever again, which fundamentally is very interesting because it contrasts with Kohut's position, in which the development was arrested development. And fundamentally he disagrees with that perspective, which is very interesting. And as I have not at present read Kohut, I don't know exactly where I fall in the debate, but I find it very interesting nevertheless. So also what I find very enjoyable as someone who has read a lot of Melanie Klein is that Otto Kernberg does go into this idea of Kleinian paranoid schizoid position and depressive position, which I think is one of the major contributions of Klein, and he does take it and use it in what I feel is a very interesting way and fundamentally very helpful way for us clinicians. In a lot of ways, Kernberg has opened up the door to treat with psychoanalysis a lot of people that we would not have necessarily thought of beforehand, but now it's virtually a possibility. Like, you'd always have to think, of course, of how you could do it, and not everyone is able to do it, and you have to be very careful. And he also gave criteria on who can and who can't, and who you should and who you shouldn't. But in essence, and if you wonder, in one of the major turnbacks or things that you shouldn't allow for therapy is people who have more perversity, that try and twist everything, that in a way are in a twistedness. In a way, he used the word malignant narcissist. In French, we would use the word perversion narcissique, but those are like the fundamental contradictions in which you should not take that person into psychotherapy. But let's be real here, it's not like you have to, it's more like guidelines. Also, he writes very clearly, like, you understand the ideas. He's very thorough, right? Like, you have to concentrate when you read him. It's not like an easy read, but it's very well explained. So on his writing, it's very nice to read him as a clinician, because he never loses, even if he's very into theories, he never loses the link with the fundamentals of psychotherapy, and that's very, very important, at least to me, and I think it's very interesting. So very fundamentally, that was an introduction to Otto Kernberg's theory. I hope you liked it. Of course, as I said at the very start, there's things that I might have missed because he was very prolific, but those were the main elements I found very interesting in his work. So I will see you in the next one.